Welcome to the Harmony of Interest series, where we explore ideas that shape our world. My name is Evan Papp, and I'm the executive producer of Empathy Media Lab, which publishes content on labor, political economy, art, and culture, and we're a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. James C. Benton, who is the director of the Race and Economic Empowerment Project, the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University. James is a U.S. historian who studies labor history and the ways in which organized labor has been affected by trade policy, economic change, and industrial decline from the New Deal to the present. He earned a Ph.D. in United States history and a master's degree in history from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. We will be discussing a multi-day virtual conference open to the public scheduled for this Wednesday, April 28th to Saturday, May 1st, called Constructing a New Social Compact, a public forum on empowering the post-pandemic working class. James, thanks so much for your time.
Sure, glad to be here, and thanks for inviting me on.
So could you begin by talking about what is the Kalmanovitz Initiative at Georgetown and also about the Race and Economic Empowerment Project?
Sure. The Kalmanovitz Initiative got its start about 2009. And it's an organization at Georgetown that really tries to do more than just research and issuing reports. It involves students who work with organizations around DC or around the country. It involves activists who work with people in organized labor, who work with faith organizations, who work with other activists across DC. And basically what we try to do is work on issues that affect not just labor, but poor people, working poor. The Race and Economic Empowerment Project is a new offshoot of KI. The basic gist of the Race and Economic Empowerment Project is to bring Georgetown and KI more deeply into the work that's already being done by people in DC to address the real and worsening economic inequalities that exist. We've got some tremendous disparities in health outcomes, educational outcomes, housing. Gentrification is a constant threat. Housing affordability is a constant threat. And so there are people in labor, there are people in faith organizations, and there are activists in different groups around town who are all working to halt this or to change it, alter it, because at the rate we're going, we really feel that it's not going to be very long before Washington becomes a city of people who can afford to live anywhere but choose to live there, and people who can't afford to live there but have nowhere else to go. And so, the Race and Economic Empowerment Project seeks to join in with those efforts and try to find ways to make Washington a more inclusive city economically for all.
And I really appreciate the work of not just being in your classrooms and teaching lessons, but trying to be socially engaged. I guess that may be part of the Jesuit tradition as well in Georgetown.
Yeah, there's a part of Catholic social teaching that talks about the dignity of workers and the dignity of work and the rights of workers to form labor unions and to organize for improvements in their lives. And I think we're squarely in the midst of that, in the midst of that tradition and that teaching. And it is also part of the Jesuit, the Jesuit mission of going out into the world and trying to do good, especially. So there's a bit of a religious component, but it's also just more of a social common good approach as well.
And then with the Race and Economic Empowerment Project, there's sometimes this debate or even sometimes like conflicting views of it's either class or it's race.
Right.
What is your response when someone tries to make it one or the other, or in general, how do you like to talk about it?
In general, I would say, I mean, a lot of my more recent work has been looking at the historical impact of slavery. And once you do that, you can be aware of class, but I have to say that in the United States, race seems to take precedent over class in many ways. And when you look at that pattern, especially from emancipation up 150 plus years, and see how some of the things that were in place in the 1860s are still with us in the early decades of the 21st century. Uh, we're in this policing crisis. Well, policing gets a lot of its impetus from slave patrols and so forth. We're talking about mass incarceration. Well, a lot of the punishments that originated in mass incarceration also got its start back in the antebellum era. Um, Convict leasing, things like that. Abuses of workers got their start through things like convict leasing. So whenever I hear the phrase, is it class or is it race, I find myself thinking, well, there's a little of both, but really I believe that race takes precedent, mainly because of the work that I've done and the things that I've seen and learned. And I know it's not as detailed an analysis as one might hope, but that's where I come down on it.
So this is a very big week for labor in the United States. There's a huge push to get senators to sign on to the Pro-Labor Protect the Right to Organize Act, known as the PRO Act. We have the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which created OSHA. And then Saturday is International Workers' Day, known as May Day or Labor Day in most other countries.
Yes.
And you have this incredible conference that's going to be online. It's open to the public, amazing panels, amazing speakers. So what was the impetus to organize this conference?
Oh my goodness. We started talking about this last year in the midst of the pandemic, when we're all sequestered on Zoom in our relative locations. And really the idea behind it was just, we kept noticing how many people observed that the pandemic had laid bare many of the inequalities rather that were built into American society. How people were being affected based on their their class status, their race, their location, the types of education they had, the types of jobs they worked, those sorts of things. And there was this feeling of, okay, people are talking about wanting to go back to normal. And the more we talked about it, the more we thought, well, normal wasn't all that good to begin with for a lot of folks. And now we're in this upheaval. And also the election played a role, because this is early middle 2020, and we don't know how the election is going to come out. So there are these things that are churning in the background that make us think, this is a time where you could see major crises, and you could see a possibility for change coming out of them. And that's basically where the impetus for this came from. We looked at it and we figured, hey, it's not just the pandemic. You've got a pandemic, you've got a climate crisis, you've got a racial justice crisis, because this was right as Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, their deaths got into the news and raised issues of police brutality, police conduct. And then you've got what we started out calling a leadership crisis, but really is a crisis of democracy. The leadership matters, but it's also a matter of, are our political leaders rising to the types of challenges that we're facing? Are they really trying to meet the needs of people, or are they looking the other direction? And so from that, we started thinking about how to build a conference that would offer a platform for people to talk about changes, to talk about how to make this period where we are starting gingerly to emerge from the pandemic. I don't think it's over, but I think we're taking steps toward the end of the pandemic. How do we move forward in such a way that we build a social compact that's more inclusive? And our model back then, because a lot of us at KI, we have I think a half dozen historians, and all of us are looking at U.S. history in some way. We were really thinking about the New Deal as the model, because for all the successes that it had, there were some real glaring failures of people being left behind or left out of New Deal legislation, people being left out of subsequent legislation like the GI Bill, and those contributed to a lot of the economic inequalities that have been exacerbated over the past 4 or 5 decades. So that's basically where the thought came from, and we just built on it, and it began to gain momentum, and finally 6 or 7 months later, and a lot of work, here we are. We've got this really amazing conference that has about 20 panels with 150 participants, and we're looking at topics like workers and democracy, the infrastructure of care, climate crisis, immigration, technology rights as workers' rights, and so forth. And I think it's going to be a really good thing for people to tune in and witness and think about as we go through this really busy week.
And I think it'll be a great way to see a lot of the who's who in the labor movement as well in the United States. And
Yes.
it'll be a great way to get people networking, I think, too,
Mhm.
to really think about, what the topics are, and kind of what we should be doing after, this coming week. And I'll definitely put in the show notes all of the registration. It is free to the public.
Yes.
And what do you hope to achieve following the conference?
You
Are
know,
there some things that you hope this will lead to?
one of the things that we talked about, and I think we landed on, is that I would say we hope to instill a greater sense of purpose and a greater sense of urgency. Not that it doesn't exist right now, because there are lots of people in communities all over the country, all across the world, who realize that things can be better, and they're moving to make things better. But I guess one of the best things you can gain from an event like this is a sense of solidarity. Many times people who are doing this work in the streets and the communities and in the schools and the churches and the civic organizations, they might feel isolated, they might feel separated from others. And conferences like these often offer a feeling of solidarity, a sense of, hey, I'm not doing this by myself. There are other people out here who I can either network with, or other people out here who I can talk with or exchange ideas with. And I think if that were to occur from this gathering, and not only this gathering but subsequent gatherings, because this isn't just a one-time conference. We see it as the start, as the convening of a process that lasts about probably about another year or so, going toward the 2022 elections, to really think about what a new social compact means, how to construct it, how to um, put it in action, and how to what I said earlier. Instead of thinking about a back to normal, think about a new normal, how to create a new normal. from where we are now.
And I couldn't agree more. This is a revolutionary moment. And the question is, which way is the wave going to break
Yeah,
after this? And we need to put in all of our efforts and solidarity and working together to make sure it breaks in the most positive manner possible. Because there is also a huge opportunity to, as you mentioned earlier, like question the whole paradigm of what got us here.
mhm,
And some of the other aspects of work is also, we need to connect the communities, the schools, the housing,
right.
jobs, everything is interconnected here.
Yeah,
So I very
yeah.
appreciate
It's the critical importance of coalitions, and not just coalitions of like-minded organizations, but coalitions of movements is really key. And I think people are doing that, but we can always use more of it, especially at times like these when we're faced with such big problems, and the response has been so cramped. Where people, instead of saying, okay, here's a problem, what are we going to do about it, how can we change it, instead, for the last few decades, it's been, well, we can't do this, we can't change this because this political group might be offended or opposed, or this legislative roadblock stands in the way. We got the pandemic, and suddenly Congress and the federal government found a way to literally create trillions of dollars overnight for all kinds of COVID relief. So don't tell me that things aren't possible. It's that you don't have the will to do it. And now, with where we are coming forward in this pandemic and all these associated crises, we need more thinking like that, as opposed to this, well, we can't do this. I don't think people really want to hear that. They don't want to hear, we can't do this. They want to hear how we can find a way to make change happen.
And the civil society and the work that you're doing is going to help with that push.
Yeah,
So
we hope.
I know we're running close on the time. And before we close, I have a couple more questions that are more focusing on your work and
Sure.
outlook. And I saw you have a forthcoming book published by Illinois Press called Fraying Fabric.
Right.
What is this book about, and when will people be able to read it?
The short answer is, we hope the book will be out in early 2022. The book itself is about trade policy from the New Deal to the present. And when I say trade policy, I don't mean a bunch of statistics about tariffs and things like that. What I mean is how workers saw trade policy in terms of foreign competition. I focus on the textile and apparel industry nationwide, which from the 1930s to the present went from being one of the largest manufacturing industries in the country, employing at one point 1 in every 7 manufacturing workers in this country, to now being maybe 180,000 workers total, textiles and apparel. So you've gone from millions of workers down to 180,000. And a lot of it looks at the trade regime that began in the New Deal. And it essentially argues that the federal government devoted a lot of attention to lowering trade barriers and promoting trade around the world, but didn't devote the same amount of effort to workers' rights and protecting workers' voices. And as a result, we've gotten all these trade agreements and trade policies that have hollowed out many communities across the country. And the result of that has been that workers who relied on manufacturing became wary of trade policy, and eventually gave up on supporting politicians who backed those types of policies, and wound up going for someone who vowed a new reaction or a new direction on trade policy. Unfortunately for them and for the rest of the country, that politician was Donald Trump in 2016. And trade wasn't the only issue that was behind his election. Of course, there were many other factors, but for a lot of working class blue collar workers, that became an issue. Now, there's a distinction because white voters, white working class voters did go for Trump harder than their Hispanic and African American counterparts. So you have to put a race analysis in there. It wasn't just all working class voters, but there was enough of a significant swath of working class voters who went that way, among a number of other issues that wound up playing a role in the 2016 election. So it's fascinating. It's a fascinating work, not because of that, but because you get a sense of how workers saw themselves and how workers saw uh, the importance of trade on their jobs and tried to say something to stop it. You think of NAFTA. This People were expressing these types of opinions in the 1950s and 1960s, well before NAFTA was even thought of. So, and even into the 1930s, they were expressing these types of sentiments. So it's important to remember that workers as labor had these really conscious views on imports and how they affected their jobs, and that's something I think that's been not lost to history, but something that we don't pay attention to as much anymore. So I think it'll be a fascinating thing. We just got to get it out into the world, and hopefully that will be sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and having gone to school during the reign of the New Democrats and
Mm-hmm.
Clinton, and globalization was this completely positive thing. But as history has shown, it's been a race to the bottom, runaway shop. And I think it's just been a way to break the back of organized labor globally
Yeah.
in some ways. And globalization, now people are starting to rethink. But
And as someone who grew up in a textile community in the South, in North Carolina, I saw firsthand, because a community that was thriving and had jobs. They weren't the best jobs in the world, don't get me wrong, but they were steady. And between the 1980s and the 2000s, those jobs vanished. And now those communities that had been thriving are struggling and scratching and clawing their way back to some kind of existence. It won't be the same, but it's immeasurably changed numerous communities around the country. You can look at all kinds of industries, and you can see the impact of not just the New Democrats' policies, but also the policies of workers. I mean, not workers, policies of businesses who are all too eager to accept these types of deals. And in some cases, the impact of organized labor's decisions to support trade as a way of fighting the Cold War, for instance. So there's no clear villain, there's no clear hero. Labor, capital, and the state all bear some degree of responsibility for what happened in the last 80 years on trade policy.
definitely look forward to checking out Fraying Fabric when it comes out.
All right.
And in closing, I want to end on some type of optimism. So where do you see opportunity and hope in 2021 and beyond?
I was wondering about I was thinking about this because we did a panel a couple of months ago on how where things were going in DC in 2021. And I gotta say that there's a good deal of, I would say, I wouldn't say optimism, but people are determined. People who are doing this type of work, whether it's in fighting police brutality, whether it's in fighting for economic justice, whether it's in fighting for greater inclusion, people are really feeling that they are on the verge of accomplishing something big. And even in the midst of what seems to be overwhelming odds, all sorts of state power arrayed against them, hostile legislation, hostile legislators, hostile public opinion. But people have decided that they really want some change. And as long as we have people who are working and organizing and demonstrating and doing this type of work, I think that's one of the greatest sources of opportunity now and into the future. And that to me is bigger than a legislative win on a bill, or um, some kind of federal program or some state program or things like that. Because if people in the communities are organized and working, there's always going to be a chance that we have there's always going to be the opportunity for us to get things right. And that's part of what we want to see through this conference. A greater sense of how do we how do we emerge from these crises? How do we navigate our way through these crises and emerge in a better place? Emerge in a place where more people have a shot to advance in this country, economically, socially, politically, whatever category you throw out. So that's the place where I see opportunity and hope more than anything else.
Dr. James C. Benton, thank you so much for your time. And everyone should go out and check out this online seminar and on constructing a new social compact. And I'll put it all in the show notes. And very nice meeting you. I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks again for the opportunity to talk today.